Hey, before you scroll past this one, sit with me for a second because I promise you this is not another 5-minute rage bait clip that tells you Trump is either a genius or the devil and then asks you to subscribe. This one's actually going to make you think, and I want you here for the whole thing. So pour whatever you're drinking, get comfortable, and let's get into it. Because something happened in Washington this week that is a lot bigger than the headline made it sound. There's an old trick that con artists have used for centuries, long before the internet, long before television. You promise something enormous, you take the money up front, and you count on the mark never actually checking whether the thing was delivered. It works because most people don't audit their own disappointment. They just feel vaguely let down and move on. Now, I bring this up not because I'm accusing anyone of running a con, of course not. That would be far too direct a thing to say on the internet, but because it describes, with uncomfortable precision, what has just happened to one of Donald Trump's oldest and most repeated promises. Bring manufacturing home, save the factories, protect the workers. And this week, quietly, without much fanfare, the bill for that promise came due. And a bipartisan group of senators, some of them Republicans who owe Trump their own careers, decided they weren't going to let the receipt get lost in a drawer. Here's what actually happened in plain terms. A small federal program called the Manufacturing Extension Partnership, MEP for short. And yes, I promise this gets more interesting than the acronym suggests, has spent decades quietly connecting small and mid-sized American manufacturers with the technology and expertise they need to stay competitive. It was created under a Republican administration in 1988. It was reauthorized under bipartisan support as recently as the CHIPS and Science Act in 2022. Both the House and Senate versions of this year's funding bill allocated $175 million to keep it running. That is not controversial money. That is not some woke slush fund buried in a budget nobody reads. That is Congress, Republicans, and Democrats together, agreeing this program works. And then, at the level of the agency actually running it, the funding simply stopped arriving. Centers were told to spend only a 1/12 of their award, 1 month's worth, until they signed new agreements the administration hadn't finished writing. Some centers tried to sign anyway. Months went by. Nothing got approved. Ohio alone lost 6 centers after more than $6 million in funding was frozen. Across the country, 90% of these centers were forced into layoffs or hiring freezes, according to reporting from Semaphore. Now, if you're the kind of person who enjoys a good irony, and if you've made it this far into the video, I suspect you are, Ohio is worth sitting with for a second, because Ohio is not some symbolic blue state casualty here. Ohio is represented by 2 of the 4 senators who are now leading the charge to reverse this. Republicans, from the president's own party, publicly on the record, forcing a vote to undo his administration's decision. Senators Adam Schiff, John Husted, Bernie Moreno, and Andy Kim introduced legislation this week to restore the program's funding and force the Commerce Department to actually release the money Congress already approved. 2 Democrats, 2 Republicans. Which tells you something, because in this political environment, getting 4 senators from opposite parties to agree that water is wet usually takes a subcommittee hearing and several strongly worded letters. Getting them to agree on anything involving Trump's own administration, publicly on a bill with his name essentially attached to the failure, that doesn't happen over a program nobody cares about. It happens when the damage back home has become impossible to explain away at a town hall. Now, of course, there's the wider backdrop this sits inside, and it's worth understanding because the Manufacturing Extension Partnership didn't get starved of funding in isolation. It got starved of funding during the final quiet unwind of the Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE, the Musk-era cost-cutting project that formally shut itself down on July 4th of this year, precisely on schedule, exactly as its own founding executive order said it would, with what one former Senate Budget Committee staffer memorably described as no closing report and no farewell. Just gone. And here's the part that I think deserves more attention than it's getting. DOGE's own dashboard, at the moment it dissolved, was still listing $215 billion in claim savings. Which sounds impressive until you remember the original target, the one actually promised at the launch of all this, was $1 trillion. That's not a rounding error. That's missing the goal by roughly 78% and still calling it a win. And the savings themselves are, shall we say, contested. Independent analysis put the real cost of the cuts, once you factor in lost productivity, the litigation, and the rehiring that's now happening, at around $135 billion. The IRS alone projects more than $500 billion in lost tax revenue tied directly to the enforcement staff DOGE cut. And overall federal spending, the thing DOGE was created specifically to reduce, went up by roughly $248 billion year over year. So, somewhere in Washington there is a very expensive chainsaw that was supposed to shrink the government and instead helped it grow. I'm not going to pretend that isn't funny. I'm also not going to pretend it isn't going to cost people their jobs for years. Because here's the thing about slashing an agency staff quickly and without much planning. You eventually have to hire some of those people back, and it turns out the federal government is now doing exactly that, at a scale that undercuts the entire premise of the original project. In the first 5 months of this year alone, agencies posted over 104,000 jobs on the federal hiring site, more than 50% higher than the same period the year before. The IRS got special authorization to fast-track 8,000 new hires after losing a quarter of its workforce. The Department of Health and Human Services cut 10,000 people last year and is now trying to hire $12,000, which, if you're doing the math at home, means HHS may end this cycle with more staff than when the cutting started. The head of the Office of Personnel Management was asked directly on the record whether there's still an active goal to shrink the federal workforce. His answer was, "I'm not hearing that," which is a remarkably careful way of saying the project quietly changed its mission statement without telling anyone. So let's put the pieces next to each other, because this is really the whole story in one sentence. The same broad cost-cutting philosophy that froze funding for a small manufacturing support program Congress had already approved, a program that, again, exists specifically to help American factories compete, is the same philosophy that ended up costing the government more than it saved, while the agencies it gutted are now scrambling to rebuild. Manufacturing jobs, meanwhile, haven't been spared the contradiction either. Since the administration's own promised manufacturing boom was announced, the most recent jobs data shows 67,000 manufacturing jobs have disappeared, not appeared, not a boom. The opposite of a boom, happening quietly underneath a message about bringing manufacturing home that never stopped being repeated in speeches even as the program built to support it was being starved on paper. Now, I want to be fair here, because a channel like this one only works if I'm being fair even when it's inconvenient. Some of what DOGE targeted was genuinely wasteful. Some federal contracts probably deserve to be cut. Nobody serious argues the federal government is a perfectly efficient machine that should never be questioned. But there's a difference between targeted efficiency and what actually happened here, which looks a lot more like broad, fast, underplanned cuts that hit at least one program with unanimous bipartisan support, forced a reversal from the president's own party, and left the government paying more to undo the damage than it saved doing it. That's not a philosophical disagreement about the size of government. That's just poor execution, dressed up in the language of a revolution. And this is where the consequences actually land because they're not abstract. A manufacturing extension center closing in Ohio means a real business. A machine shop, a parts supplier, a small factory with 40 employees, loses access to the engineer who was helping them adopt the equipment upgrade that would keep them competitive against overseas suppliers. That's not a Washington story. That's a Main Street story that happens to have Washington's fingerprints on it. And when 4 senators, evenly split by party, stand up together to force a reversal, that's not politics as theater. That's what it looks like when the gap between the promise and the reality gets too wide to paper over anymore, even for the people whose own re-election depends on defending the administration. So, where does this actually go from here? Honestly, and I try to be honest with you rather than dramatic, probably nowhere fast. The bill has bipartisan sponsors, which sounds significant, but bipartisan sponsorship and an actual floor vote are two very different things in this Congress, and there is no shortage of ways for legislation like this to sit quietly in committee until everyone stops asking about it. What's more interesting, longer term, is what this moment reveals rather than what it immediately changes. It reveals that even inside Trump's own coalition, there is now a functioning tripwire, a point at which the political cost of defending a cutback home outweighs the value of staying loyal to the administration's messaging. That tripwire didn't exist, or at least didn't get triggered publicly for most of the last year and a half. It just got triggered over factory funding in Ohio and New Jersey, which, honestly, might be the most Washington ending imaginable. Not a scandal, not a resignation, not a dramatic hearing with lights and cameras. Just 4 senators, 2 parties, quietly agreeing that the government should probably pay for the thing it already said it was going to pay for. And the fact that this now counts as a bold, headline-worthy act of political courage tells you almost everything you need to know about where the bar currently sits. I'm Marcus Fenn. This is Borderlines, analysis from the edge. If you want more of this, the kind that actually sits with the numbers instead of just reacting to the headline, stick around and subscribe, because this channel is just getting started. And the most important stories, as always, tend to be the quiet ones.